Welcome back to BYoungMinistry.com, to another blog and to another podcast. Today we are in Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11, which reads, "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown. Whoever has ears, let them hear what the Spirit says to the churches. The one who is victorious will not be hurt at all by the second death." That's Revelation chapter 2, verses 8 through 11. Life is best understood when we see the two realms, the visible and the invisible. And in order to understand the invisible, to see it, we must be well versed in the Scriptures. In this invisible realm, much is happening that impacts us who live during what theologians call the church age. Whereas Revelation chapter 1 gives a description of John's first vision of the Lord Jesus, the entire church age, which began in Acts chapter 2 and is yet ongoing, is described in little detail in Revelation chapters 2 and 3. In Revelation 2 and 3, we have 7 messages from the Lord Jesus to 7 different churches. 5 of these 7 churches received very harsh words from the Lord Jesus. 2 of them did not. In the case of these two, the churches at Smyrna and Philadelphia, there were no harsh words. These 2 churches had not given in to the pressure of persecution. Smyrna was one of the major centers of emperor worship in that day. As early as 26 AD, during the reign of Tiberius Caesar, a temple had been erected to the emperor, and thus the Christians of Smyrna were confronted with the challenge annually to choose between saying Jesus is Lord or Caesar is Lord. This meant that a great deal of pressure and persecution came upon this church because of their unwillingness to say Caesar is Lord. There was also a large community of Jews within the city who were hostile to the Christian faith, as we will see. In verse 8 of today's text, we read, "To the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again." Smyrna means myrrh. It is a very fitting name because myrrh is a perfume, the fragrance of which is released by crushing. Here was a church that was being crushed through persecution. It was tough to be a Christian in Smyrna because they had to live constantly between 2 extremes. There was within the church a rich and loving fellowship, but outside, in the city, they faced continuous, cruel, and persistent hostility. Notice how the Lord reveals himself to them, the first and the last, who died and came to life. Those are extremes, first and last, death and life. The Lord Jesus presents himself as the Lord of the extremes, and he is the Lord of all visible and invisible forces. In verse 9 we read, "I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." The Greek word used for afflictions here pictures the crushing, unending pressure upon these believers in Smyrna. Then the Lord Jesus says to them, "I know your poverty." Smyrna was a prosperous city, but it may have been that this poverty was caused by the persecutions they were experiencing. Their homes perhaps had been pillaged, their possessions taken from them. This was common in the early church in times of persecution. Yet the remainder of the first half of verse 9, we read, "Yet you are rich." In spite of their suffering, their fellowship was deep and meaningful. This is what persecution does. It causes the persecuted to draw closer to one another because there is the deeper need for one another. Riches and fame do not make us happy. The true riches of this life come from a heart that is being given to the Lord. In return, the heart experiences the filling of God's grace and love. In this context, deep relationships are formed with others, and they become most dear and precious to us. This was the experience of the church at Smyrna. In the remainder of verse 9, we read, "I know about the slander of those who say they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan." There was a smear campaign going on against these Christians. Lies were being told about them, and because they refused to visit the pagan temples or to acknowledge the pagan gods, they were called atheists. The synagogue there in Smyrna celebrated the fact that they worshiped the one true living God, yet they had rejected their Messiah. And in rejecting their Messiah, Judaism demonstrated that it was as satanic as emperor worship or the worship of any other false god or any other false religion. They disdained Christ, therefore they disdained God. In verse 10 we read, "Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you life as your victor's crown." The church at Smyrna received the greatest amount of persecution because they held true to the Lord most. This, by the way, is the first mention of the devil in the book of the Revelation. The Lord acknowledges that he who is the first and the last is going to allow this to happen. The devil will put some of them in prison, which were some of the most terrible places where prisoners were faced with the threat of persecution and execution at any moment. Tests like these are designed or allowed by God to strip us of our superficial supports that we have been leaning on and to show us how much we have truly learned to rely upon the grace and the strength of God. The words 10 days indicates that it is the Lord who is sovereign over the events of our lives. We do well to pray for protection, but if the Lord allows persecution, we do better to pray that His will be done in and through our lives. Interestingly, Polycarp was the elder of this very church at Smyrna. In 155 AD, at the age of 86, Polycarp was sentenced to death by being burned at the stake for his faith. He had refused to say Caesar is Lord. When he died, he gave an eloquent testimony of his love for Christ. As a teenager, he had known the Apostle Paul and had probably heard from his very lips the truth recorded here in the book of the Revelation. In verse 11, we read, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt at all by the second death." All of these churches received the same message. He who has an ear, let him hear. The second death here is explained in Revelation chapters 20 and 21, where we are told plainly that it is the terrible lake of fire, the symbol of the final judgment of those who refuse the gospel of the grace of God. It is prepared for the devil and his angels, but it will be shared by those who choose the devil's way. They will be separated forever from God, tormented in spirit and soul, pictured by the torment that fire gives to the physical body. My friends, I trust this blog and this podcast are helpful to you in your walk with the Lord. If I can be of further assistance to you, don't hesitate to shoot me an email at BYoungMinistry@gmail.com. Hey, have a great day.